We're ready, Judge.
Nope.
State calls Dr. Sam Andrews to the stand.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Please be seated.
Good afternoon, Dr. Andrews.
Good afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself, please, for the record?
My name is Sam William Andrews, and I'm a forensic pathologist.
All right. Are you the forensic pathologist that did the autopsy on James Boyd?
I was the forensic pathologist that supervised a fellow trainee doing the autopsy.
Okay. Tell me what that means by supervising the fellow trainee.
At the Office of the Medical Investigator, we have up to 4 fellows in forensic pathology, and these are usually board-certified pathologists doing an additional subspecialty training in forensic pathology.
Okay. And what is your role in supervising the autopsy?
My role is observing the autopsy, observing the bodies. I don't physically stand there and watch the entire autopsy. I'm available for questions if any arise. I obviously look at the body, look at any injuries that may be present. The fellow would generate a report that I edit, make sure that the conclusions are appropriate and correct, and ultimately I sign.
Okay. What is the purpose of an autopsy?
An autopsy in a medical legal setting is to determine cause and manner of death.
And were you able, without giving the opinion yet, were you able to determine cause and manner of death for Mr. James Boyd?
Yes.
What kind of training do you have to be able to do that?
We all have a medical degree, either an MD or a DO. I have completed a 5-year residency in anatomical pathology. I then completed a 1-year subspecialty training in forensic pathology, and then we can practice.
Okay. What interested you about forensic pathology and caused you to go into that field?
It's just fascinating to me to be able to look at a deceased individual and determine, and attempt to determine cause of death to help families, public, and it's just interesting, I guess.
Okay. How long did you work for the New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator?
I started July 1st, 2011.
And are you still working for them?
No, I finished May 18th, 2015.
Where are you working now?
I'm at the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office in Austin, Texas.
If you will look in your exhibit notebook there, as states Exhibit 44, is that a fair and accurate copy of your resume of your qualifications and experience?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I believe states 44 in that.
Any objection? No objection, Your Honor. I don't, Your Honor.
44 will be admitted.
And I will offer Dr. Andrews as an expert in forensic pathology.
Any objection from either side?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
You'll be allowed to offer opinions in that area.
Doctor, do you have any special training in determining what is an entrance and what is an exit wound as far as shots are concerned?
As part of our subspecialty training in forensic pathology, one of the things that we do learn are entrance versus exit wounds due to gunshots.
Okay, and how is one able to tell where the bullet goes in and where the bullet comes out?
There are certain characteristics of entrances versus exit wounds. Entrances typically are more round or oval, more distinctive. They can have radiating skin tears or lacerations. Depending on range, there can be some findings on the skin, such as soot or gunpowder stippling, which are little pinpoint abrasions. Exit wounds tend to be more of a laceration, where the skin can be reapproximated so that you can't really tell if there's a defect there. They won't have any of the soot or stippling, for example, and they tend to be less distinctive than an entrance wound.
Okay, and were you able to identify the entrance and exit wounds on Mr. Boyd's body?
Yes.
All right, let's talk about how you received Mr. Boyd's body. Where did it come from?
It came from the hospital, the University of New Mexico Hospital.
And why did it come from the hospital as opposed to from the foothills?
According to the investigation from our death investigators, he was taken there after he was shot to attempt to resuscitate or save his life.
And it was not successful?
No.
On the body, both internally and externally, was there evidence of medical intervention in trying to save his life?
Yes, there was.
When the body comes in, do you take a photograph of the body as it comes to you in whatever state it comes to you in?
Yes.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes.
And why do you do that?
Photographic documentation of how we receive the body as well allows us to confirm the intervention that was present.
All right. And did you do that in Mr. Boyd's case?
Yes.
you could turn to 47. A, please. And is that the photograph that OMI took of Mr. Boyd's body as it came to them?
Yes.
And were you able to identify this person as James Boyd?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would move 47A into evidence.
Any objection?
No.
None, Your Honor.
47A will be admitted.
Okay. I'm going to place this on the Elmo here. And if you can tell me what all these things are on the external part of Mr. Boyd.
All the medical intervention?
Yes, sir.
He has, I guess starting from the head, he does have a tube within his mouth that goes into his lungs called an endotracheal tube to assist him to breathe. There was a tube placed also in the mouth that went into the stomach called an orogastric tube. He had pads, one pad on his chest. The big one is a defibrillator pad. There was a second one on the back. There were on the upper right chest area, there was a square, what they call an electrocardiograph patch, which allows them to monitor for heart rhythms. On the upper left chest area, there's a intravascular catheter into the subclavian vein. It's a blue catheter we see there. On the lower chest and abdomen, there's a...
And let me move that up a little bit. What is this device here, this thing here?
So covering that is a clear plastic film that was put on at the hospital. The abdomen, he had what they call laparotomy to gain access to the abdominal cavity for the injuries. It was left open, it wasn't closed, and so they packed it with the material and then covered it with this dressing. At the very bottom of the photograph, there's a little drain, and that's what that round blue device is.
All right, thank you, Doctor. That's 47A. Did you then attempt well, the other thing I didn't ask you is what happened to his arm? He doesn't have an arm in that picture.
Correct. So at the hospital, he had a right arm amputation that was ultimately sent to us, but removed at the hospital.
Why did you ask them to send you his arm in addition to his body?
So we could examine it for any injuries as well.
Let me ask you to turn to page, to Exhibit 47B. And is that a picture of the arm that was sent to you from the hospital?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move 47D into evidence.
You said D as in dog?
D as in dog, correct, Your
Any
Honor.
objection?
No.
None, Your Honor.
47D will be admitted.
Is that, and I'm wondering if I can figure out how to zoom this thing out. Zoom this out a little bit.
That's as far as it goes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Is that a picture of Mr. Boyd's arm as you received it there at the office of the medical investigator?
Yes.
Okay. Were you able to identify all of the entrance and exit wounds?
Yes.
And when you're examining a body, you don't know what order the shots came in, do you?
No, I don't.
Objection, lead.
Sustained.
All right. Do you know what order the shots were fired in?
No.
So how do you go about labeling the various entrance and exit wounds?
It's arbitrary.
All right. So can I pick a picture to start with, which is 47B? And can you tell me in 47B and 47C what you labeled the entrance and exit wounds depicted in that picture?
In photograph 47B, this is a gunshot defect labeled D, and that's an entrance wound.
Okay.
And in photograph 47C, the gunshot wound labeled E is the exit wound.
And are these wounds in the left arm of Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd move 47B and 47C.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
They will be both admitted.
Let me put 47D on the screen there. And can you tell me what part of the arm that shot went into?
This is the upper left arm, almost in the midline of the arm. It passed through the skin and soft tissue and muscle of the arm only.
All right, and let me put on 47C. Did that bullet exit Mr. Boyd's body?
Yes, it did.
Okay, and what is depicted in this picture?
This is the exit gunshot wound that corresponds to the entrance wound
Okay,
D.
and I think we're missing that 47D. I wonder if we can maybe change the brightness or something here. Says E on it right there. And can you also see in this picture the portion of the entrance wound as well as the exit wound?
Yes.
Okay, and is that depicted here? That's the entrance wound, and this is the exit wound.
Yes.
Okay, and can you show me on your own body where that was and how it came through?
On my body, the entrance would have been on the upper left arm here in the midline.
Okay.
The exit would have been a little lower down on the side of my upper left arm.
All right, and would it help you to explain this to have a diagram?
Sure.
All right. Let me show you what's been marked as states 46. And if you, could I have him step down, Judge?
Yes.
I want to make sure the court can see this as well. And I lost my great pen. There it is. Doctor, can you show on this diagram where the entrance and exit wounds are here? Yes, and also maybe color them in too.
Okay. Wound D here is an entrance wound that corresponds to the exit defect E.
All right, thank you. And if you can just stay up there, I'll ask you about these other ones. Did you also identify a wound in 47E? And if you can turn that, and were you able to identify the entrance and the exit wound for the shot depicted in 47E?
Photograph 47E is depicting this wound right here, labeled C. This is an exit wound. And not shown in photograph 47E is the entrance, which is B here on the upper right arm.
And was there anything that interfered with you being able to determine the entrance wound, or were you able to do so?
No, I was able to do so.
And was it in the part of Mr. Boyd's arm that was not severed, or was it in the part of his arm that was severed?
It was in the part of the arm that was not.
It was not severed. Okay, can you put an indication to where approximately Mr. Boyd's arm was cut off?
This line right here, where I believe it was amputation, is where approximately it was amputated.
All right. Your Honor, I would move Exhibit C into evidence. I mean, pardon me, State's Exhibit 47E into evidence.
Any objection to 47E?
47E?
E.
No objection, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
47E will be admitted.
Okay, and does that depict the exit wound that you have drawn on your diagram, Doctor?
Yes.
So can you show me sort of the path, the little arrow between the entrance and exit on that one? Okay. And on the other one, can you do the same thing, show entrance to exit with the arrow? All right. And then there was a third, well, let me ask you about this wound that caused the amputation. What kind of damage was done to the inside of Mr. Boyd's arm as a result of that shot that you labeled C?
This gunshot wound went through the skin and subcutaneous tissue of the arm, as well as the muscle and the upper right arm bone called the humerus, and it shattered the humerus. There's significant destruction of the bone, and then exited through C.
Okay. Was that a life-threatening injury?
Yes, it could have been.
And without medical attention, what would have happened to somebody with that particular injury?
There would have been significant blood loss due to the vascularity of the upper arm, so he could have lost a lot of blood and died.
All right. Let me ask you about the last bullet wound, and I've got two pictures here, and I want to cover up part of it. If you would look at 47F and 47G. And can you tell me what that depicts?
Photographs 47F and G show the back of Mr. Boyd showing an entrance gunshot.
Okay, and 47F, is that how the body came to you?
47F, yes.
And also depicts the patch that for medical intervention that you saw there?
Correct.
And then 47G, it appears that somebody has cleaned that off. Is that something that you do?
This was actually a photograph that was taken at the hospital by one of our investigators prior to the body coming to our office.
All right. I move 47F and 47G, Your Honor.
Any objection to those?
No, Your Honor. No.
The 47F and G will be admitted.
Can you point out for the court, Doctor, where the entrance room was for that, the bullet in the back?
It's this wound here labeled A on the lower left back.
And was there an exit wound for this particular bullet?
There was the exit wound after passing through the abdominal and chest cavities exited at labeled F within the left armpit or axilla. I'm sure that's it. It then re-entered the upper left arm at G, and a bullet was recovered from the upper left arm.
Did this bullet in the back stay inside of Mr. Boyd's body?
Yes.
Ultimately? And were you able to recover that bullet?
Yes.
Okay, if you will take a look at 47J, does 47J depict the exit and entrance wounds that you just talked about under the armpit?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move 47J.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
47J will be admitted.
And can you show for the court the exit and then re-entrance wound under the armpit in this particular photograph?
From the diagram?
Yeah, that'd be good.
The exit wound from the torso is F here, and it re-entered G on the upper right arm.
All right.
Upper left arm, sorry.
Okay, and then let me show you a photograph we've already admitted, which is 47B. And can you see on this picture where the bullet ended up on 47B? The bruising on the right arm.
Yes, there's bruising here.
Bleeding.
Sustained.
Can you identify where the bullet ended up on 47B, as in boy?
Yes. Right here, would have labeled the blue contusion or bruise of the upper left arm. We found the bullet just below within the muscle, below the bruise.
All right. When you find a wound like this going in the back and ending up in the left shoulder, do you do something to try to trace the path of the bullet?
We try to determine the trajectory based on the deceased lying on the autopsy table. Sometimes we use a probe that shows the directionality of the bullet if it's helpful.
All right, and so what organs did this bullet go through?
After entering the skin of the lower left back, it went through the 12th rib, left the rib at the back. It then went through a muscle along the vertebral column called the psoas muscle. It then went through the left adrenal gland, the transverse colon, which is part of the colon that runs across our body. It then went through the diaphragm, which is a muscle that separates the chest and abdominal organs. It went through the left lung. The left lung has two lobes, a lower lobe and an upper lobe. It went through both of them. It then exited the skin at F and re-entered the G.
All right, and on this diagram, can you sort of draw an angle from A up this direction to show sort of the path of the bullet?
Of course, it's a two-dimensional diagram, but it would be going this way, but also from back to front.
So going through the body and ending up in the shoulder?
Correct.
All right. You said you sometimes use a probe to try to determine the path of the bullet. Did you do that in this particular case?
Yes.
And I'd like you to take a look at 47H and 47I. And does 47H show the probe that you tried to use to line up the path of the bullet?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move 47H. And does 47I show some of the medical intervention that the healthcare providers did to try to save Mr. Boyd's life?
47I is a photograph of the diaphragm, the muscle separating the abdominal and chest cavities, with blue sutures or stitches through it to close the defect that was present.
All right. Was there an effort by the people at the hospital to try to sew up all these holes in Mr. Boyd, all his various organs as this went up to his left shoulder?
Specifically, I don't know exactly what they did, but
Right.
they did remove his spleen, they removed a portion of the transverse colon that had the defect, and they repaired the diaphragm, and a portion of the left lung, the lower lobe of the left lung.
All right, Your Honor, I'd move 47H and 47I.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
47H and 47I will be admitted.
Okay, and does 47H, is that the probe that you put in to try to show the path of the bullet?
Yes.
Okay. And I don't think you need to show 47I. You said that you were able to recover the bullet from his right shoulder, is that right?
Left shoulder.
Left shoulder, I'm sorry. If you'll take a look at 47K, can you identify that, please?
Yes, this is the bullet that was recovered from the left deltoid muscle in the upper left arm.
Your Honor, I move 47K into evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. No.
47K will be admitted.
Okay. You put that on the screen. Are you trained in identifying what kind of bullet it is?
We have a general training, but it's not our expertise.
All right. When you find a bullet or some projectile inside of a person's body on autopsy, where do you send that bullet?
We will clean off any tissue or blood that's on the bullet. We will photograph it, as we have here, put it in a sealed envelope with a label of the decedent that I signed, and it gets released to the law enforcement agency that is investigating the case.
All right. You don't scrub off all of the material on the bullet, do you, sir?
We clean it as best we can, but we don't scrub it.
All right. Do you label it as a biohazard?
It's got a label on it, and it gets put in a biohazard bag.
Okay, and why is it labeled as a biohazard?
It has come from the body, so there's potentially blood and tissue on it.
Okay, and you don't scrub it off or put it in like a sterilizer to sterilize it before you send it out, is that
No.
right? Okay. I want to talk about the other injuries that are not shots that you found on Mr. Boyd's body. What other injuries did you find to Mr. Boyd's body?
On the right buttock was a contusion, depicted here in the diagram. He had lacerations or tearing of the skin.
Okay, let me stop you before we go to those, because I want to show a picture of that one. Can you take a look at State's Exhibit 47L and tell me if that depicts the bruising on his right buttocks?
Yes, it does.
Okay, and what was your understanding of where that came from?
From what I understand, that came from one of the beanbag shots that was fired at Mr. Boyd.
All right. I'd move 47L, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
47L will be admitted.
Okay, and does that depict the bruising here on the right-hand side that you have on your diagram there
Yes.
from the beanbag shotgun? Okay, and then you said you also found on his body tearing and ripping of one of his extremities. Can you tell me which one that is?
So on the right shin or lower right leg, there was a somewhat triangular laceration, as well as some abrasions or scraping of the skin.
Okay, and how about on the back of the leg?
On the back of the right leg, near one of the leg veins called the popliteal fossa, there was another skin tear or laceration, and then in an area on the upper right calf of abrasions.
What was your understanding of where that came from?
Now, these are consistent with the dog that was released.
All right, and can you look at O, M, and N and tell me if those are depicted in O, M, and N?
Is that 47?
47, yes, Your Honor, I'm sorry.
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, I move 47, O, M, and N.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
47 O, M, and N will be admitted.
Let me put up first the front of the leg that you talked about, the triangular mark there. on the front of Mr. Boyd's leg. Is that depicted in 47O?
Yes.
Okay, and then does 47N depict additional damage from the dog bite to Mr. Boyd's leg?
Yes.
And how about 47M? Does that depict the damage to the back of Mr. Boyd's leg as a result of the dog biting him?
Yes, it does.
Thank you, Doctor. If I can have just a second, Your Honor.
Okay.
Doctor, in this case, you have something that you usually don't have in a, you can sit back down if you would, please. Yeah, sorry. That you usually don't have when you're doing an autopsy, and that is a videotape of what happened.
Correct.
And I'd like to show you several stills from the videotape of the shooting of James Boyd and ask you if the angle of the officer is consistent with the shots, the path of the bullets that you found on Mr. Boyd. Are you willing to do that?
I'll have to see.
Okay, all right.
Your Honor, I'm going to object, unless this is part of what he did specifically for his case as an OMI doctor doing an autopsy. This seems like this is beyond the scope of what he was recognized as an expert in. Now he's going to be interpreting video, which I don't think was part of the autopsy. I might be wrong, but I don't think it was.
Oh, Judge, I think whenever someone from OMI comes and testifies, you can ask him if the bullet trajectory that he saw is consistent with a particular position of the person and the person fired.
You had an objection as well?
I did, Your Honor. If it was the same objection, I'll join that objection.
I believe it falls within his area of expertise, and if he can offer opinion by looking at the video about the trajectory or path, I'll allow him to do that. So I'll overrule the objection.
All right. Dr. Andrews, I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 48A and tell you that this person is doing the shooting here.
Yeah, just one more continued objection here. I think we asked him very clearly in a pretrial interview, is there anything else that you're going to be testifying to? And we covered this kind of stuff, but nothing along in the video or pictures of the video. And he said, no, I'm not going to testify anything else. And now apparently they're expanding it, which doesn't give us the kind of notice that I think the court anticipated that we get.
Ms. Bregman, did you have these photographs and everything at the time that you interviewed this witness?
Yes, but the point was I asked him, is there anything else other than this what he was going to testify to? And he said no.
We also asked him, Your Honor, if he was planning to testify as to anything having to do with the position of the deceased or the shooters in this case, if you could tell anything about the trajectory of the bullets based on what he had reviewed, and he said that he wasn't going to be testifying about that as well.
I don't think that was ever asked, Judge. And so the court knows, in this case, we've done an extraordinary thing that's not required of the state to do for preliminary hearings, which is we have allowed the defense to interview all the witnesses who are going to testify. And that's not required by any preliminary hearing, and we made all of the state's witnesses available to the defense before the preliminary
No,
hearing.
I'm going to allow him to testify to it. I understand that oftentimes witnesses don't know. I mean, they can say they're not testifying to anything else because the questions come from the attorneys, so I'm not sure if they really know what else might be asked of them, but I will allow the state to proceed, counsel.
All right. Dr. Andrews, this fellow is the one that is shooting the first shot. I want to ask you if this person shot the first shot towards Mr. Boyd, is that position consistent with the shot through the left arm that you showed, and I forgot the letters, I'm sorry, doctor, for the one through the left arm. Is it?
D&E.
D&E, yes, sir.
Based on this photograph, I can't specifically say that the entrance and exit wounds D&E came from that shooter.
Okay. And that's because you can't see the left arm in this particular photo?
The left arm is there, but it could have come from another direction as well.
All right.
I can't be specific.
Let me show you what's been marked as states 48B, and let me move this down so the glare is not quite so bad on this. Again, assuming this shooter is the position of that shooter consistent with the bullet wound that is in the right arm, which I think is B and C?
Again, just based on the photograph, I can't say specifically that the gunshot from that shooter resulted in that injury.
Okay, and you would leave that up to other people like accident reconstructionists to
Yes.
testify? Okay.
Some leading.
Sustained.
Would you leave that opinion up to other people to testify about?
Yes.
All right. And let me show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 48C, which has I think the tracer of this particular gun, different shooter now here, with Mr. Boyd leaning forward. Let me ask you if that trajectory matches up with the bullet wound you found in Mr. Boyd's back.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, and is it consistent with the trajectory you found going from front to back and up Mr. Boyd's body?
Yes.
All right. Were you able to determine the cause of death for Mr. Boyd?
I certified the cause of death as gunshot wounds.
All right, and what did you certify as the manner of death?
Homicide?
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Cross-examine?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
We spoke before, I think it was by phone or video conference, am I right?
Correct.
Okay. So the last part you just mentioned, homicide, what you found as the cause of death is homicide. That's the medical terminology, right?
Correct.
It's not a legal definition that you use.
Correct.
Okay. You understand there's a distinction between the two?
Yes.
Okay. And you're not giving a legal conclusion there, you're simply using the medical term that you've been trained to use, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I would like to, can I move around just to go to that?
Yes.
I would like to talk about this first wound that you spoke about. This one, I think it's right here, D. Is that the first one we were talking about on direct?
Yes.
That bullet went through Mr. Boyd from a frontal direction, coming at him at his front, right?
Yes.
And it went through the front of his arm. In other words, if he's like this, it came through right where, I'm not a medical guy, but that's my bicep, right? So right through the bicep, right?
Yes.
And so it came through the front, and you're absolutely sure of that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then it came out the back.
Yes.
Okay. Now, can you please tell me, within a degree of medical certainty, which one of these bullets, I think you mentioned 3, right?
Yes.
With a degree of medical certainty, which one of these 3 bullets caused the death of Mr. Boyd?
They all potentially could have caused the death of Mr. Boyd.
You've mentioned could have, sir. I would like you to tell the court what did cause the death. Not could have, but what did.
Gunshot wounds caused the death of Mr. Boyd.
You don't know which gunshot wound specifically caused his death then?
The gunshot wound to the lower left back, labeled A in the photograph, was probably the most severe and most rapidly lethal injury. However, I can't discount the others as contributing to death as well.
Okay, so I do understand that when you first were asked this question, Doctor, that you determined the cause and manner of death, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell me which one of these bullets caused the respiratory or heart to stop on Mr. Boyd?
I can't give you just one.
You said that, for example, the bullet that was up in this arm, where it was amputated, where it entered B and exited C, and it crushed the, what was the bone?
The humerus?
The humerus, it shattered that bone, right?
Yes.
Your language was that it could have been blood loss if he didn't receive medical attention, right?
Yes.
He could, because you were asked the question, could he die from You are not saying he did die from that bullet wound, are you?
I'm saying that bullet wound contributed to his death.
Contribute. Did he get medical attention, do you understand, at some point after he was shot?
Yes.
Okay. So, did you make the determination that that either one of the two, well, let me say this. Would he have died without this bullet that went in a D and came out?
Untreated, potentially.
Potentially, but again, we're trying to do what you, I think, understand in this courtroom is what the actual specific cause of the death was. You said the bullet that went through his back caused the most damage. Is that correct?
I don't know if I'd say the most, it was severe damage.
Well, it went through his internal organs, did it not?
Yes.
Internal vital organs, did it not?
Yes.
Including his lung, right?
Yes.
Now, this bullet that went through the left arm through the front and came out the back, you said if left untreated could have caused his death?
Yes.
But not necessarily, right?
Yes.
And the same thing with the one that went through B and came out C could have caused his death, but not necessarily, right?
It was a severe injury as well that could have caused his death.
But not necessarily caused his death, right?
That could also be said for the one to the back as well.
Okay, so the one to the back could have caused his death, but not necessarily either.
Yes.
So you don't know which bullet caused his death then, correct?
It was a combination of the gunshot wounds.
Okay, so how did the bullet that went through his arm on the left side contribute with the other one? Just this specific bullet. How did it contribute with the one that went through his back to cause his death? How did this bullet, D, contribute to cause his death?
It could have added blood loss.
Not could have, but how did it, sir?
It
You
would have
keep
bled.
saying could have.
Well, it bled.
It bled, but you don't know whether or not it bled to the extent that it would have caused death, do you?
In and of itself,
Yes.
potentially, but I
You do
can't
not
think for
know,
sure.
in fact, how much any of these wounds cause for bleeding, right?
Correct.
Okay. So again, I really want you to help me understand when you say could have doesn't mean did, does it?
Right. But we can't test these things.
You can't test these things. So you cannot say, you're saying that overall he died because of gunshot wounds, but you cannot testify what bullet caused the death.
I can't specifically say one over the other.
Okay. So, well, which one caused the most bleeding, do you know? Internally.
Well, the gunshot wound A.
What's that?
Gunshot wound A
I'm sorry.
to the lower left back.
To the lower left back. And you just described how many different organs I think it went through on direct, right?
Correct.
How many different organs did it go through?
It went through muscle, it went through the left adrenal gland, the spleen, the transverse colon, and the left lung.
Okay. So, let me just, to be clear, if he was shot on D and he was shot on B, those two things by themselves, can you say within a reasonable degree of medical certainty that he would have died? Just those two.
Treated or untreated?
Well, he got treatment. We all know that, right?
So with a medical degree of certainty, likely not.
So if you take the combination of the two gunshot wounds and just these two gunshot wounds to the arms, the degree of medical certainty is that he probably would not have died based on the circumstances that you know, correct?
Correct.
That's far cry from actually causing his death, right?
Sure.
Have just a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Doctor. I just want to make sure that I understand one of the terms that you used earlier. I believe that that Ms. McGinn asked you to look at Exhibit 48C, and I'll ask you to look at that again.
Yes.
And she asked you, I believe, whether the trajectory that you can see looking at Exhibit 48C was consistent with that shot being the one that hit the lower back, correct?
Yes.
And I believe you testified that it was potentially consistent.
Yes.
Now, you're not testifying that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that was the shot that hit the lower back that's depicted in that photograph, correct?
I can't see that.
Moment, Your Honor. I pass the witness as well.
Lead right.
Taking off my sweater. Mr. Bregman asked you whether the bullet went back to front, and so I want to ask you this question. If someone is standing this direction and puts their arm out and you are shooting at me, is the trajectory of the bullet that is, again, I keep forgetting which one it is, D and E, would that go into the front of the arm and come out the back of the arm? Would that be consistent with that kind of shot?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Bregman asked you if the person might have been, Mr. Boyd might have been able to survive with just these two shots. I want to ask you if he just had shot A to the back and did not have these two shots, can you say whether or not he might have been able to survive to a medical degree of certainty?
Potentially, but a trauma surgeon would be better able to answer that question.
All right. And so why did you come up with the opinion that all three of these shots contributed to cause his death?
It's a combination of potential blood loss, of injury to internal organs. In the greater picture, I can't specifically say one versus other
All
caused
right.
death.
And this shot, of the two shots to the arms, which one was the most severe?
The one to the upper right arm.
And why was that so severe, and what kind of blood loss did that cause?
It was severe because of the damage it did to the bone, the humerus. I can't speak of the blood loss.
Right.
I can't determine that.
Is amputating somebody's arm, does that cause blood loss too?
Yes, I can.
All right. I mean, could you amputate someone's arm without blood loss?
Again, trauma surgeon is better able to answer that question, but there's going to be injury to blood vessels.
All right. And what was your understanding of why they had to amputate his arm?
From what I understand,
Objection made, calls, might be calling for hearsay. I don't know what this is based on. I don't know if it was part of his actual autopsy. From what I understand, I don't know if this was done at the time he made the decision or now he's saying something.
I'm going to allow him to answer the question. Overruled.
from what I understand, it was that it couldn't be repaired.
There was so much damage to his right arm that they had to amputate it.
Yes.
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Was that your understanding, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay. Hold on just a second. Doctor, I forgot to ask you about tox results. Did you do a tox screen on Mr. Boyd?
Yes, we did.
And what did that find?
Objection beyond the scope.
Sustained as to beyond the scope, Counsel.
All right. What was the purpose of doing a tox screen?
Just to, I guess, paint a greater picture of the decedent.
All right. Did you do a report, Doctor, documenting your findings?
Your Honor, this is beyond the scope as
I
well.
thought it was sustained.
Yeah, Counsel, I think we're going into a whole other area than what was covered on
I
the
am, Judge,
direct.
and it's only because I forgot it. Do you want me to recall him and ask him this question, or do you want me to ask him
I'm going
now?
to sustain the objection, Counsel.
Okay. All right, Your Honor, I would move into evidence State's Exhibit number 46, the diagram that I created.
Any objection to 46?
No, Your Honor.
No objection.
46 will be admitted.
All right. Your Honor, I think we're done with Dr. Andrews.
Doctor, I had a question for you, and if you could look at State's Exhibit 47C, would you look at that, please? Just so I have a clear understanding, I believe you testified, but correct me if I'm wrong, D is the entrance wound and E is the exit.
Correct.
And everyone has been, at least what I heard, is the bullet went in and came out the back, but when I look at this exhibit, it looks like it's the side. What part
It's more
of
the
arm?
back and the side.
Back and the side?
Yeah.
Could you point and show me?
Actually here.
Okay. All right.
Can I just see that too?
Oh, I'm sorry.
From the same angle?
If his arm was like this, as we have the photograph, it'd be over here.
Your Honor, can we ask that the witness describe for the record exactly which part of his arm is pointing to, since that won't...
Sure.
Sure. So it's the upper left arm, on the side of the arm with my palm facing the ceiling, a little bit towards the back of the arm.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. You may step down.
May I ask one more question?
Yes, sir? Is it based on what I asked?
It is, just based on the description.
Okay.
So that for the record, if there's a more exact medical term for the position of the arm where the exit wound was.
The lateral left arm, or the lateral upper left arm.
Okay. All right, thank you, Doctor. May he be excused from the case, State?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Doctor.
All right. We can have Brock Nipra back, Judge.
I'm sorry?
Brock Nipra, this is his cross-examination.
All right. And also, I'd like to remind you have been sworn and you're still under oath to tell the truth.
Yes, Your Honor.
And I believe we left it off where neither side had cross-examined the witness yet. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Honor.
Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, Officer Nipra.
How are you doing, sir?
Now, I'd like to begin asking you several questions regarding Ms. McGinn's direct examination due yesterday afternoon. Near the end of her direct examination, Ms. McGinn, she asked you about the harm that can be caused by words, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, she implied that words by themselves cannot harm you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, during your CIT training and your overall experience as a law enforcement officer, you have learned that words can be very meaningful, correct?
That's correct.
Words spoken by an individual can offer you, as an officer, insight into their thoughts, correct?
That's correct.
Into their feelings, correct?
That's correct.
And into their intentions.
That's correct.
Fortunately, another individual's words are not the only source of information you have as an officer. Is that correct?
That's correct as well.
In fact, another individual's actions can provide you with information regarding an individual's thoughts, correct?
That's correct.
Their feelings,
That's correct.
and their intentions.
That's correct as well.
Now, would you agree that an individual's actions can bring validity to the words that they speak?
Yes.
Now, during your time as a CIT officer with the Albuquerque Police Department, you have experience dealing with people who have suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you talked about those experiences yesterday.
Yes.
And when dealing with individuals who are suicidal, words are also meaningful, correct?
That's
Objection on
correct.
the relevance.
Counsel, response? Your Honor, yesterday Ms. McGinn went into, well, not into length, but addressed the meaning of words, and I'm simply just going to provide a brief example of how meaningful words can be.
All right, I'll allow you to continue over.
Now, I want you to consider an example, Officer Niprath. If you're confronted with an individual who is threatening to take his or her own life with a knife, that's a serious situation, correct?
Correct.
Now, in that situation, based on your training and experience, even if you don't see a knife in that individual's hands, you still take that threat very seriously.
I'm going to object again, Judge. I think there's no issue in this case that Mr. Wood was suicidal. And I think they're now trying to pose hypotheticals to someone who is a lay witness.
So you're saying this is beyond his expertise? Is that the objection, or?
No, Judge, I think they're now, he isn't called as an expert witness, he's called as a lay witness, and they're now proposing hypotheticals to a lay witness, which is improper. He's just a prescient witness for the scene, not being called as an expert witness to give opinions as an expert.
Can you tell me where you're going with this?
I'm simply just providing a brief example of how words, based on Officer Niprath's experience as an officer, how those words have meaning and how those words can gain some validity based upon an individual's actions.
So long as it's within his experience as a CIT officer, I'll allow him to answer the question.
So based on your training and experience, Officer Niprath, even if you don't see a knife in that individual's possession, the individual who threatened to kill himself with a knife, you still take that threat very seriously, correct?
Correct.
Now, however, if that individual is holding a knife when he threatens to kill himself with that knife, that threat becomes much more serious, correct?
Correct.
In other words, the presence of the knife brings validity to the words being spoken by that individual.
That's correct.
Now, is it fair to say that words in combination with someone's actions are the best indication you have as an officer of someone's intentions?
Yes.
Now, is it fair to say that if someone threatens to kill you or a fellow officer while they're holding a knife, that provides you with a good understanding of that individual's intentions?
That's correct.
And in fact, based on your training and experience, that statement would lead you to believe that individual wanted to kill you or the other officers with the knife they had in their possession, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Ultimate issue.
And I think we're getting into the area of speculation at this point, so I'm going to sustain the objection.
Understood, Your Honor. Now I'd like to talk to you about your experience dealing with mentally ill individuals and the statements they make. Now, as a CIT officer, you have had contact with a wide array of individuals who display strange or bizarre behavior, correct?
Correct.
And in some situations, that behavior can be attributed to mental illness, correct?
Correct.
Now, during your direct examination with Ms. McGinn, you explained that paranoid schizophrenics commonly hear voices, correct?
Correct.
They can have visual hallucinations,
Correct.
and they can also have delusions of grandeur.
Correct.
Will you please explain what a delusion of grandeur is?
A delusion of grandeur is believing that one is either more important or something more than what they actually are. An example would be believing that you're God or the Messiah or that you're Napoleon or the President.
Now, based on your training and experience, does the fact that an individual is displaying signs of mental illness change the level of threat they pose to you as an officer?
Yes, it does. When someone's not in touch with reality, it changes the ability to predict what they're going to do. When you're dealing with a rational person that's not suffering from those types of illnesses, it's easier to kind of gauge how they're going to behave or how they're going to react to a given situation. An individual that's suffering from mental illness and has kind of lost touch with reality by displaying those kinds of signs to us, it makes it much harder to predict what they're going to do.
So it's fair to say that an individual with mental illness poses a greater danger to you as an officer than an individual who is not burdened by a mental illness.
That's correct.
Now, you also, during your direct examination yesterday, you talked about your CIT training in de-escalation, correct?
Correct.
Now, as a CIT officer, you've been trained how to use de-escalation techniques to resolve dynamic situations. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Now, despite that training and experience you have, or maybe in light of the training and experience you have, there are certain situations that your CIT training just simply, that you with your CIT training, you simply cannot resolve using de-escalation techniques, correct?
Correct.
Now, based on your experience in the Albuquerque Police Department as a CIT officer, it's fair to say that CIT officers carry weapons, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, some CIT officers have been qualified and on occasion carry long guns or rifles, correct?
Correct.
And you as a CIT officer have been qualified to use a long gun, correct?
Correct.
And you also carry a sidearm, correct?
Correct.
And even when you're trying to resolve a crisis situation with your CIT skills, you carry a gun, correct?
Correct.
Sometimes a rifle.
Yes.
And you carry those because you aren't always able to de-escalate a situation.
Correct.
And in fact, if you are unable to de-escalate a situation, depending on the threat posed, you might have to use deadly force, correct?
Correct.
Now, you also talked about when to stop using CIT techniques. And you told Ms. McGinn that you as a CIT officer have been trained to stop using CIT techniques, both de-escalation and trying to build rapport, when it becomes unsafe to do so, correct?
Correct.
And overall, officer safety is paramount, correct?
Correct.
So your safety comes before any attempt to build rapport or de-escalate a situation, correct?
That's correct.
Now, briefly, you also talked about K-9 officers and K-9 police service dogs, if you will, correct?
Correct.
Now, you testified regarding the nature of a K-9 bite, correct?
Correct.
And you also testified about how dogs are trained to hold on bites, correct?
Correct.
Now, you haven't received any K-9 training specifically, have you?
No.
And you've never actually been a K-9 officer?
No.
Now, I'd like to move into the March 16, 2014 incident. On March 16, 2014, you overheard a call for backup over the radio, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, the radio traffic that you were listening to indicated that open space officers needed backup, correct?
Correct.
And they needed backup because they were dealing with an individual who was armed with a knife and refusing to comply with commands.
That's correct.
And at the time you received that call, you were in southeast Albuquerque, somewhere near Tramway and Central, correct?
That's correct.
And after hearing the call for backup, you decided to respond, correct?
That's correct.
And you decided to respond because, one, open space officers had called for backup, correct?
That's correct.
Two, you had been CIT trained, correct?
That's correct.
And three, you had come to know that this call dealt with an individual who you learned was homeless, correct?
That's correct.
And you had had prior experience with homeless people in the Northeast Heights, correct?
That's correct.
And you thought you might know this individual.
That's correct.
Now, as we sit here today, you're aware that the individual we're talking about is James Boyd.
That's correct.
When you arrived at the scene, did you in fact know James Boyd?
No.
So you had no prior experience dealing with James Boyd?
No.
After hearing the call for backup, you responded from your location near Central and Tramway, correct?
That's correct.
And while responding, you were listening to your radio and reviewing your computer-aided dispatch report.
That's correct.
And tell me, what is a computer-aided dispatch report?
Anytime a call is placed to 911, the 911 call takers create what we call basically a CAD. And what it is it's an electronic record of the call. And it can be used to be sent to our computers in the cars and update officers on information relating to calls.
And so you reviewed that CAD, if you will, to gather information regarding this incident.
That's correct.
And as you reviewed that CAD, you learned that an individual, James Boyd, had threatened officers with knives.
That's correct.
You also learned some information regarding Mr. Boyd's criminal history, correct?
Correct.
You learned that he had acted violently towards APD officers in the past.
If I may, that information for us didn't come to light until we were already on scene because he hadn't been identified until later in the call.
Okay. But during this incident, you learned that James Boyd had been violent towards APD officers in the past.
Yes.
And in fact, he committed at least one aggravated battery on peace officer, correct?
That's correct.
And based on your training and experience, that's a felony crime.
Correct.
Now, this incident was located in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains near the top of Copper, correct?
Correct.
And in order to get to the incident, and according to the CAD you read, you responded to 812 Piedra Vista, correct?
That's correct.
After you arrived, you exited your vehicle and walked towards 8112 Piedra Vista, correct?
Correct.
And at that time, you were armed with a sidearm, correct?
Correct.
And you also had a rifle, correct?
That's correct.
Do you approach every call with a rifle?
No.
Why did you approach this call with a rifle?
Because the comments that we had received over the air and on the call indicated that Mr. Boyd was armed, and having a rifle in that particular situation gives us a distance and advantage in dealing with an individual armed with knives.
So based on what you learned about Mr. Boyd and his actions while driving to the call, that caused you to approach this incident with a rifle, correct?
Correct.
Now, after you exited your car, you approached 8112 Piedra Vista and walked through a side yard at that residence, correct?
Correct.
After walking through the side yard, you entered through a gate, you entered the foothills. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And when you walked into that foothill area there, you saw several officers in the foothills.
That's correct.
Now, is it fair to say those officers were roughly a quarter mile from you?
It's a fair estimate.
And they were significantly higher than you, correct?
That's correct.
Now, in particular, you saw two open space officers,
Correct.
Officer Mike Monet,
Correct.
and at that time you knew Mike Monet as someone who was CIT trained.
That's correct.
You also saw Officer Wetterland,
That's correct.
and you saw Sergeant Carpenter.
That's correct.
After seeing those officers, you approached him.
That's correct.
You walked up the hill to him.
That's correct.
And when you arrived at those officers' locations, you spoke with Sergeant Carpenter.
That's correct.
And after speaking with Sergeant Carpenter, you decided to take a position on higher ground, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, that position, and when I say take position, you walk to a higher ground, essentially, correct?
That's correct.
And there was a rock there, correct?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say it was a boulder?
That's a fair assessment.
And you knelt down behind that boulder?
Yes.
And you knelt down behind that boulder for cover, correct?
Correct.
And what is cover?
Cover is anything that's going to provide protection from either objects thrown or objects fired at you.
And why did you feel you needed to take a position of cover in this case?
For two reasons. Number one, it creates what we call an intermediate barrier, so something that an individual would have to go around or over to get to me. And number two, because it provided also for me to have more of a concealed position to be outside of Mr. Boyd's line of sight.
Now, at that position of cover, you were there with your rifle, correct?
Correct.
And it was your understanding that you were providing lethal coverage, correct?
That's correct.
And what is lethal coverage?
Lethal coverage means that I'm responsible for shooting Mr. Boyd should he make an active attempt to harm the other officers on scene.
And at the time you were providing lethal coverage, did you see Mr. Boyd with a knife?
I saw him stick his hands in a pocket, but I don't recall ever seeing the knives come out.
Okay. So throughout this incident, you did not see his knives come out?
Not to my recollection.
Now, despite your CIT training, you never spoke to Mr. Boyd.
That's correct.
And why not?
Because Officer Monet was handling that portion of the CIT. He was actively engaging with Mr. Boyd, and Mr. Boyd seemed to be, at the very least, having a dialogue with him. And as long as one person on the CIT team is maintaining that dialogue, we like to keep them talking.
So you essentially did not want to interrupt the dialogue that was occurring there?
That's correct.
But you were able to hear the dialogue?
Parts of it, yes.
And based on your training and experience, was Officer Monet de-escalating this situation?
It was touch and go at times. He would de-escalate him, and then Mr. Boyd would re-escalate, and it just kind of continued in that cycle for the entire time Officer Monet was talking to him.
So despite Officer Monet's efforts, Mr. Boyd continued to go up and down his attitude, correct?
That's correct.
Now, while listening to the officers talking to Mr. Boyd, you noticed that he'd get particularly agitated when officers talked to him about his knives, correct?
That's correct.
And yesterday you referred to that agitation as something, it's called a hot button, correct?
That's correct.
Will you explain what a hot button is again?
A hot button is any issue or statements that we make that agitates or escalates an individual.
So when Officer Monet or other officers on scene would ask Mr. Boyd about his knives, he'd become agitated.
That's correct.
Now you'd also notice that Mr. Boyd would become agitated when officers would talk to him about coming down from his elevated position, correct?
That's correct.
So that was another hot button issue for Mr. Boyd.
That's correct.
Now you remained in your position of cover behind that rock for roughly 30 minutes.
Yes.
And during that time you were providing lethal coverage.
Yes.
And there came a time when tactical officers arrived, correct?
That's correct.
And you were ordered to move away from Mr. Boyd's position and set up a perimeter, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now when you moved up to that rock where you assumed cover, where were the other officers located?
They would have been west of my location and slightly south.
Okay. So is it fair to say that you were facing, there was a neighborhood below there, you were facing that neighborhood, correct?
That's correct.
Now in your training, have you been trained on, when you have a lethal weapon, paying attention to your backdrop?
That's correct.
Did you have any concerns regarding your backdrop in this case?
Based on my angle of fire and where Mr. Boyd was, I estimated that any rounds that, if I had to fire, would roughly go into kind of the rocky area behind him.
Okay. So you weren't worried about the neighborhood because you thought your rounds would go into rocks or the ground behind Mr. Boyd?
That's correct.
So after tactical officers arrived, you were ordered to go set up a perimeter?
That's correct.
And that perimeter was located further down from where you were?
That's correct.
And it's fair to say that it was almost level with where the gate was, where you walked into the foothills, correct?
That's correct.
But it was significantly to the northwest, correct?
That's correct.
Now from that position on the, well, before I move into that, you were ordered to set up a perimeter, one, to keep civilians out of the area, correct?
That's correct.
And you'd seen civilians in the area.
That's correct.
And these were individuals who were hiking and biking in the area.
That's correct.
In addition to being ordered to keeping those individuals out, well, before I move on, why were you ordered to keep those individuals out?
Because we don't want to introduce anyone that's not part of the incident into the incident. We don't want to provide Mr. Boyd with someone to take as a hostage. We also don't want them interfering with police operations, like walking in front of an individual that's ready to make a lethal shot.
So it was mainly for the safety of the community that you were ordered to keep those individuals out.
That's correct.
And the second purpose of a perimeter, though, is to keep Mr. Boyd in, correct?
That's correct.
And that was also one of your duties on that perimeter.
That's correct.
Now, from your position on the perimeter, you were unable to see Mr. Boyd, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because you were too low.
That's correct.
And you were also unable to see the officers who were near Mr. Boyd.
That's correct.
And you weren't able to hear what they were saying, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you were there at the time shots were fired,
That's correct.
and you heard those shots,
That's correct.
but you didn't actually see what occurred, correct?
That's correct.
You did not see what Mr. Boyd was doing prior to the time you heard shots, correct?
That's correct.
You did not see what the officers were doing prior to the time you heard shots.
That's correct.
At the time you heard shots, you could not see Mr. Boyd,
That's correct.
and you could also not see the officers, correct?
That's correct.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
No further questions. Pass the witness.
Don't have a lot. That was fairly thorough of some of the questions I wanted to ask too, but just to make sure I don't miss any, and if I repeat anything you said last time on direct or just now, I apologize, but I just want to, I don't have a lot, we'll get through this fairly quickly. Officer, good afternoon.
Afternoon, sir.
Part of your CIT training tells you that you want the person to focus on one police officer, right?
That's correct.
In other words, all these officers, and it's been said that there was, at some time or another, there was 19 officers in the area. None of the others should be engaging or trying to engage with Mr. Boyd as well, right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Boyd tried talking to you, didn't he?
Yes, sir, you did.
And you did not talk to him, did you?
No, sir.
And you didn't respond to him because, as your CIT training told you, he's already engaged with Officer Monette,
That's correct.
and that's what he's supposed to be doing, just him.
That's correct.
So that's because in your job, you were lethal cover, right?
That's correct.
And your job is to protect in case there's a lethal threat or a deadly threat to an officer or a citizen, right?
That's correct.
That is your only job at that time, right?
That's correct.
Despite the fact that you were a CI trained officer up there at the time, your job was lethal coverage, right?
That's correct.
And your job meant that if Mr. Boyd took a deadly threat with 2 knives towards an officer that you perceived as a deadly threat, you would have shot him when you were up on that mountain, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir.
Objection, Your Honor, ultimate issue.
I'll sustain the objection, disregard the answer.
You were able to observe him for some time, meaning Mr. Boyd, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
You would agree that he was agitated whenever officers would ask about his weapons. I think it was referred to earlier as a hot button, but he got agitated, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
His demeanor during the entire time that you were able to observe him was either neutral or aggressive, correct?
Correct.
Actually, his demeanor never de-escalated to a calm place, ever, did it?
No, sir.
You were listening to the police radio when you were on that mountain with Mr. Boyd, correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, that's every police officer should be listening to the radio when they're in a situation like that, right?
Yes, sir.
You learned on the radio, listening to the radio reports that Mr. Boyd had been violent in the past. I think you've already testified to that, right?
That's correct.
And violent in the past with officers.
That's correct.
Now, I think you just spoke about this, but just to kind of sum it up, the reason that you all have a perimeter, and you had a perimeter in this particular instance, was because you were concerned for the safety of the public, right?
That's correct.
You didn't want Mr. Boyd to be able to get down the mountain into the neighborhood and hurt somebody, right?
That's correct.
You didn't want him to be able to get down the mountain, slip away from the officers, and hurt some child with a mother on a path, right?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Sustained. The reason was that you didn't want him to be able to hurt anybody.
That's correct.
And your understanding was, based on hearing the radio traffic, that he was going to be taken into custody, right?
That was my understanding, yes.
It was never an option for you to simply let him walk off that mountain, was it?
No, sir.
Just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
I'm good, Your Honor. Thank you.
Can you redirect?
Thank you, Judge. Officer Nieper, thanks for coming back. Based on your last answer, when the police officers were then telling him that they were going to get him a voucher for a motel, was that not true?
And my understanding was that we were planning on taking him into custody.
All right, so when they promised him they would take him to a motel, that was not true, is that right?
That's my understanding.
All right, and since yesterday, we've actually gotten a hold of a videotape of a different angle of this whole scene from Mr. Thixton's camera. We've taken a still from that, and I'm going to present that to you. It actually shows you, the picture I showed you yesterday, you couldn't find yourself, but in this one, I think we can, okay? Let me hand you what's marked as Exhibit 20. 26E, and this is not in your materials, Judge, because we didn't have this till last night. Can you tell me if that is a fair and accurate depiction of the scene as when you were out there?
Yes, ma'am.
And, Your Honor, I'd move 26E into evidence.
Any objections to 26E?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor. Will be admitted.
Okay. Can you show me where you are, Mr. Officer Nick? Is this you here?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And in this photograph, can you identify the other officers in this particular photograph?
I believe that's Officer Monet.
Okay.
That is one of the state police officers.
Okay. How about this fellow in front?
I believe that's Officer Weatherland.
All right. And these two here, are those the two open space officers?
Objection leading.
I'm sorry, Judge. These two here, who are those people?
I believe those are the open space officers.
And
ma'am.
who is this fellow right here?
I believe that's Sergeant Carpenter.
Okay. And here, that's Mr. Boyd.
That's correct.
All right. That's all the questions I have, Your Honor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Officer, for coming back.
All right, thank you, Officer. You may step down. May he be excused from the case, State?
Yes, Your Honor.
Dismissed? Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Judge, if I can give you this for your book, because you don't have this one yet, so. I think it needs to probably be 3 whole pages.
If Your Honor.
Your Honor. 5-minute break, a 3-minute break.